Shalom Havarim, hello friends. Good to be with you this second Sunday of Lent 2021. Have you ever given much thought to the meaning of your name? Not only your first name, but also your last name. And when you put them all together, what does that really signify? What does that mean? You know, Shakespeare famously said something along the lines of, "What's in a name? A rose by any other name still smells just as sweet." And if you know that line, you know it's from Romeo and Juliet. We have the Capulets and the Montagues, and Romeo's saying, you know, really, what's a name about this? These last names aren't that important. All that really matters is that we are in love. But I think that there's more to it than just that. You know, I'm not saying that Shakespeare's wrong. Not trying to offend him or anyone else. Not that Shakespeare's actually going to watch my YouTube sermons. Anyways, I just think there's more to a name than that. Think about it like this. What your parents named you gives you some sort of insight into what their expectations were for you, especially if you start considering what your name means. So my full name is Kevin Matthew Gosser. Kevin means kind and gentle. Matthew means a gift from God. Gosser is one who lives on a back road. Okay, so your parents probably didn't give you your surname. Often those are based on former occupations of your ancestors or where you lived. Millers and weavers, these were people and did those kind of work. But kind and gentle, a gift from God. I would think that my parents probably looked up those names in my name and to see what the meaning was. Just a bit of a tangent. If I was going to be a girl, I was going to be named Mandy. I don't know what Mandy means, but a lovely name nonetheless. But they chose Kevin Matthew. Again, it speaks to their expectations for their newborn son. When our children were born, we named one based on the meaning of his name. We chose the other one's name based on the sound of the name. Again, we were very intentional in choosing those names, but we also chose those names for different reasons. So keep that in mind as we work through today's text from the Hebrew Scriptures, from the Old Testament. I mentioned last week that during Lent we would be working through these Old Testament covenants. And again, I remember that covenant is kind of a strange word to us in our 21st century world. We don't have many covenants, but a covenant is an agreement. It's a promise between a party and then with God. God is always a part of this agreement. It could be more than one party, but it always includes God in some way. I differentiated a marriage covenant from other contracts in that God is present in that covenanting experience. Last week we looked at the covenant between God and Noah and all the animals, where God promised to never destroy the world through flooding again. This was God making this promise to Noah and the created animals. So today we're going to look at some more covenants. We're going to look at this covenant between God and Abram. And I would know that there's two different kinds of covenants. The covenant that God made with Noah is what we call an unconditional covenant. God just comes out and says, this is what I'm going to do, or this is what I'm not going to do. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. But this covenant that God makes with Abram is a conditional covenant. There is an if. If you will do this, then I will do that. Now, I need to warn you before we look at this covenant that today's sermon is going to be PG-13. If you know the story, you know where we're going with this. The covenant with Abram involves some discussion of some body parts, and it may be a little awkward to have young children in the room as you watch this. But you know, the Bible is PG-13 at places, sometimes even rated R in places. You know, I'm looking at you, David and Bathsheba. But today's going to be about PG-13, just to give you fair warning. All right, let's go ahead and look at this text for today. It's coming to us from Genesis chapter 17. And in this passage, God is confirming this promise that he made with Abram 5 chapters earlier in the book. In chapter 12 of Genesis, God promises Abram, I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars of the sky and the sand of the seashore. Now, years have passed since that initial promise was made. And Abram is now 99 years old. His wife, Sarai, is 89 years old. They're kind of past their prime child birthing years. But God shows up, God speaks to Abram, and he says this in verse 1 through 2. He tells Abram, walk before me faithfully and be blameless. And here's the condition. Then I will make my covenant between me and you, and will greatly increase your numbers. Now, it seems like over these years since God initially made this promise to Abram, Abram's faith was kind of wavering, and understandably so. It had been years, and like I said, his best childbirthing years, child rearing years are beyond him. He has some question, he has some concern. But this time God, as a sign of this covenant, gives this outward manifestation of their covenant, a sign of the covenant. Abraham and all of his male descendants were to be circumcised. Why circumcision? I try to put myself in Abram's sandals, and I imagine that Abram's there. He knows the story about Noah. He knows about the sign that Noah was given. Do you remember the sign that Noah received? Noah got a rainbow in the sky. So I imagine that God is there talking to Abram. I'm going to give you the sign of the covenant that your descendants will be as numerous as the stars of the sky and the sands of the seashore. And this sign will be circumcision. And Abram's just like, can I get one of those rainbows instead? But why circumcision? I think the reason is it's very simple. It's because this involves the male reproductive organ. And every time that Abram would enter into the act of reproduction, he would be reminded of this covenant. And 9 months and 8 days later, 8 days after a male offspring was born, he was to have that male child circumcised as well. It's a reminder that this covenant was not just for Abram, but for his descendants and their children after them and their descendants after them and generations to come. These generations after generations after generations were there because God had made this covenant with Abram. Now you can rightly ask, why don't the women get some sort of a sign of the covenant? And I think it's a good question. And about the only answer I have is that this is a symbolic of the culture in which they were living at the time. It was cultural that these things, the inheritance and all that was passed on patrilineally from male heir to male heir. But here this sign of the covenant was given to Abram and all his male descendants. But it's not just the Hebrew descendants. We often think of Abram as the first Hebrew. But this also applies to those of us from Gentile background as well. At least according to the Apostle Paul it does, and I tend to take Apostle Paul at his word. He was one of the greatest apostles, the greatest evangelists in the New Testament era. Paul writes this in Romans chapter 4, verses 9, and then again in 12. He's asking the questions, is this blessedness, this covenant with God, is this blessedness only for the circumcised or also for the uncircumcised? Is it just for the Jews or also for the Gentiles? He goes on, and he, Abram, is then also the father of the circumcised, who not only are circumcised, but who also follow in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abram had before he was circumcised. I know that's kind of tricky. But also the circumcised who are not physically circumcised, but are following after God in their footsteps, following after example of faith. This applies not only to the Hebrew people, but to the Gentiles as well. Now, if you keep reading in this text, you soon realize, and I've probably slipped up a few times and used the wrong name. I know that happens. But this sign of circumcision isn't the only sign that's given to Abram. There's more to it. There's this name change that's involved. God comes in and changes Abram's name. And you're like, what, can you do that? Can you just change someone's name? I'm now going to call you Fred. You're now going to be Willie. Maybe I don't have the authority to do that, but it's God. So I guess God can do whatever God wants to. And if God wants to change your name, I think we'll go with that. So God comes in and he tells Abram, you will now be called Abraham. And Abraham means father of many. To Sarai, he says, Sarai was Abram's wife. Sarai, he says, you now will be called Sarah. And Sarah means princess of a nation. He's taking the root of their name and he's expanding it. Father of many, princess to a nation. And if you read this text carefully, you may realize that even God's name is changed. Maybe God's name isn't changed, but God has given a new name. For this is the first time that God is ever referred to as El Shaddai, God Most High. Now, I said earlier that when your parents named you, the name that they gave to you may reflect their expectations for you. So if your parents named you Brock, they probably had expectations that you were going to be a tough guy, maybe an athlete or a football player. If your parents named you Wolfgang, they were probably expecting that you would be a great musician. If they named you Vincent, they probably thought you would be a great artist. The names that your parents gave you reflect their expectations for you. Others will come along then, your friends, your contemporaries, your coworkers, and often they will give nicknames. Sometimes these nicknames are neutral. We have nicknames like Skip. Why would somebody be called Skip? I don't know, maybe because they have a light personality and an upbeat kind of view on life, or maybe they just like to jump around. It's rather neutral. Sometimes these nicknames are hurtful. Sometimes people can call you ugly, or fat, or stupid, or a disappointment. The nicknames that others give us often reflect their view and their perception of us. But notice here that God looks at us, and nobody knows us better than God does. God looks at who we are, and God looks at who we're going to become. And God gives us a new name. Names like beloved, child of God, and blessed. Now, if you look at the story of Abram was a strange fellow. He made some big mistakes in his life. God could have given Abram a new name and called him the guy who tried to pass off his wife as his sister just to save his own skin. It'd been a really long name, but that was reflective of something that Abram actually did. He tried to pass off his wife as his sister to save himself. But no, he didn't choose that. He chose to name him Abraham, the father of many. When God gives us a new name, it's not just an understanding of who we are, but it's about who we will become. Our parents give us names based on their hopes and expectations. Our peers give us nicknames based on their perceptions of us. But God gives us a new name based on who we really are and who God is calling us to be. And we are called through Jesus Christ to be a people of the covenant that God made with Abraham. We are called to be children of Abraham, descendants of Abraham. And indeed, we are called to be the children of God. So what is in a name? Perhaps sometimes not much. Perhaps it was just a name that our parents liked that day. But when God gives us a name, it's about who we truly are and who we will become. All right, my friends, have a wonderful week, and we'll check back here again next time.